In 37 AD, Rome crowned a god who prayed only to himself. His name was Caligula, a man who believed cruelty was the purest form of truth. Beneath marble ceilings and golden laurel wreaths, mercy became theatre, and agony became art. He would kiss a woman's hand before destroying her family smile at a senator while condemning his bloodline. Rome thought it had found salvation. It had created a predator in the shape of a savior. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak. He was born into the empire's bloodstream son of Germanicus, the beloved general who had embodied Rome's virtue. Soldiers adored the boy who played among them in miniature armor, calling him Caligula Little Boots. From birth, he was trained to see power not as duty, but as spectacle. When Tiberius died, the empire erupted with joy. At last, a god of kindness had come to restore the old world. The Senate opened the prisons. The crowds threw petals. For the first time in years, people dared to hope. Caligula's kindness was the first act of his cruelty, a test to see how easily love could become obedience. He rewarded the loyal, then humiliated them in public. He elevated nobles, then stripped them bare before their peers. He turned intimacy into theatre, and faith into a trap. He did not just kill, he made death wait. He made for a last. Soon, the city realized the pattern. Every gift was poisoned, every embrace a performance. He would smile as men begged for mercy, pause just long enough for gratitude, and then order the blade. His genius was not madness, it was precision. He understood what Rome itself had forgotten, that an empire built on conquest needs cruelty to feel alive. At first, Rome called it rumor, just another emperor's indulgence exaggerated by jealous senators. But rumors in Caligula's Rome were not exaggerations. They were advance warnings. The Senate had always been the theatre of Rome's dignity. Marble floors, echoing with oratory, the air thick with legal precision. Yet, under Caligula, it became a different kind of stage. A place where silence was the only safe language. The emperor began summoning senators and their wives to the palace for consultations. These sessions often ended not in decrees, but in humiliation. Wives trembling were paraded before the ruler who now claimed divine rights over all mortal unions. The Senate's legal debates on marriage and morality were mocked in the most literal way possible by being physically inverted. Caligula would interrupt discussions on inheritance laws with jokes about whose wife was most beautiful or most obedient. The laughter that followed was forced mechanical, a sound manufactured under threat. For those who didn't laugh, the punishment was ruin, confiscation of property, exile, or disappearance. Rome's most powerful men discovered that law itself could be violated from the inside out, turned into a performance that mocked its own solemnity. In one recorded incident, he ordered the marriage of his loyal officer's wife, Ennia, to be annulled so that he himself could marry her for a night. When the officer protested, Caligula reminded him that imperial desire was a decree stronger than any Senate edict. It was not lust, it was law. This was the chilling innovation of his reign, the fusion of legality and desire. What had once been the empire's proudest invention, the codified law became the emperor's instrument of private gratification. Every forced union, every seized wife, every public insult was justified under the same principle that built Rome's greatness. The will of the sovereign was itself the law. Ancient sources describe his taunting tone during these humiliations. He would emerge from behind curtains at banquets mocking noblemen about their wives' performance. The laughter he demanded was more terrifying than any sword, because it was an oath of submission. Rome's men bowed deeper with each insult, proving that obedience was the only remaining virtue. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through this era, later wrote that tyranny begins where shame becomes entertainment. Caligula understood this perfectly. He weaponized shame, transforming the Senate from a council of rulers into a chorus of spectators. The men who once wrote laws now performed obedience in his theater of domination. In doing so, he discovered a profound political truth: to rule Rome, one must not only command its bodies, but also its definitions. If the emperor could redefine a marriage, redefine decency, redefine justice itself, then every act of cruelty became legally sanctified. The result was a new kind of governance, one that did not need armies to enforce compliance. It relied on humiliation. Every senator who endured his wife's violation in silence became part of the system's self-perpetuation. To resist was treason. To suffer quietly was proof of loyalty. Behind the spectacle of sexual excess lay a terrifying bureaucracy. Imperial scribes recorded the gifts and favors of women taken from noble houses, classifying them like property transfers. A wife could vanish into the palace one night and return legally diminished the next. The documents of empire reflected not the chaos of madness, but the precision of accounting. Even religion bent beneath this perversion of law. When Caligula declared himself the living Jupiter, divine marriage itself became his legal domain. He claimed the right to bless or desecrate any union under heaven. In the emperor's mind, Jupiter had many consorts. So too would he. His decrees on sacred chastity were written in the same ink as his private invitations. The line between divine authority and personal lust dissolved completely. For the people of Rome, this was not merely scandal, it was revelation. They saw that the empire's entire hierarchy built on law and ritual could be turned against them with a single command. Every system, marriage, property, religion, proved fragile once the ruler's desire entered the equation. Yet, there was something even darker beneath the political mechanics. Caligula's actions were not random cruelty. They were experiment tests to see how far Rome's conscience could bend before breaking. Each public violation was a question posed to the collective morality of the empire. Will you still obey? Will you still believe in the sanctity of law when the law itself become obscene? And Rome answered yes. Through silence, through applause, through taxes paid and temples maintained, the empire validated the system that desecrated it. When the Senate assembled, every man knew what had happened in the palace the night before. They signed decrees, adjusted budgets, and delivered speeches about divine favor. The machinery of state turned smoothly lubricated by fear. The Republic's corpse still moved, but only because humiliation had become the new form of governance. Caligula had proven something eternal, that domination need not rely on visible violence. When the law itself is corrupted, the body becomes its own prison. The marble pillars still gleamed, the city still prayed, but Rome's heartbeat had changed rhythm. Beneath the robes and rhetoric, every senator carried the knowledge that the next decree might strip him not only of power, but of dignity itself. If the law could be rewritten by desire, what would happen when desire demanded the sacred itself? By the second year of his reign, the lines between Caligula's private chambers and the administration of Rome had vanished. The palace was no longer a seat of government, it was a marketplace of flesh. Senators who once debated taxes now paid them in humiliation. Nobles arrived in ceremonial togas and left stripped of dignity their wives and daughters, renamed, catalogued, and priced like merchandise. The ancient chroniclers wrote of these events with trembling restraint. They called it Caligula's house of state. To the emperor it was efficiency. To the empire it was revelation. He had realized that the body could serve as both currency and message. What gold could not buy loyalty, fear, reverence, humiliation could. So he turned the palace into a brothel, not of secrecy, but of symbolism. Rooms once used for imperial councils became perfumed chambers. Marble corridors echoed not with footsteps of envoys, but with muffled sobs. Invitations were issued not as threats, but as duties. Wives of senators, noble matrons, even priestesses were ordered to serve guests in one of the divine Caesar, and they came. Because refusal meant treason. Coins clinked on polished marble as men of Rome's soldiers, merchants, even ambassadors were instructed to pay for entry. The money went to imperial coffers. Caligula's agents recorded every transaction, turning degradation into accounting. The empire's treasury, drained by endless games and monuments, found new liquidity through forced vice. It was taxation by body, an innovation Rome had never dared imagine. The emperor's motives, though, wrapped in madness, carried a cold logic. By erasing the boundary between public and private, he dismantled the last defense of Roman morality. There could be no virtue left to oppose him once every virtue had been sold under his roof. The symbolism was deliberate. Every man who entered the palace to pay for pleasure knew that he was also paying tribute. Every woman who served knew that her body was now part of the state's revenue. The humiliation was collective. Rome itself was being prostituted. Ancient sources describe senators watching their wives serve strangers, while the emperor stood laughing, tossing coins like blessings. When one nobleman wept openly, Caligula is said to have told him, "Why grieve, senator? You should thank me. Your household now serves Rome." It was not lust, it was governance. The brothel was bureaucracy, the bed a throne. He even issued tokens bearing his image, small bronze discs used for admission to the house of Jupiter. Archaeologists later found similar objects near Palatine Hill, marked with inscriptions suggesting regulated access. Each carried the emperor's profile, his smirk immortalized beside the word Divus, the divine. It was as if Rome's gods now stamped consent onto every act of defilement. Witnesses say that during these nights, Caligula would walk the corridors in disguise, a hooded spectator to his own spectacle. He would pause at doorways watching senators kneel not in debate but in submission, whispering prayers that were indistinguishable from moans. He wanted to see if power could survive its own degradation, and it did, because even this system worked. The treasury refilled, taxes flowed, foreign ambassadors arrived with gifts unwilling to offend a god. Rome's machinery of empire still turned powered by the same citizens it humiliated. The moral structure of the city cracked quietly like marble under stress. The line between sacred and obscene dissolved so completely that even priests began to justify it as divine theatre. If the emperor is God, one wrote, then his acts are beyond sin. And that was the perfection of Caligula's plan. By collapsing shame into ritual, he made vice untouchable. His crimes became liturgy. The empire's worship of authority became indistinguishable from its appetite for humiliation. In the morning, when the candles burned down and the perfumed air thickened with despair, scribes returned to their desks. They stamped seals, calculated revenues, drafted new decrees. The machinery of empire resumed unbroken. The night screams were filed under income. By then, no one could tell where the body ended and the state began. Caligula had fused the two into a single organism. The empire itself became his flesh, its veins his pleasure, its gold his desire. Every Roman who entered the palace participated in the act, some as buyers, some as victims, all as witnesses. The Senate debated once more about taxation and morality, pretending the stench of the night before did not linger on their robes. Yet deep down, each man knew the brothel had become the blueprint. The empire had discovered a new resource: humiliation as economy. The question was no longer how it began, but who would dare end it. If the palace could be turned into a market, what would happen when the temples followed? The Roman world measured everything grain oil distance. Even blood spilled in the arena. But under Caligula, a new unit of value appeared: the body. Every body in Rome had a price. Not only slaves, whose names were already inked into ledgers, but wives of senators, daughters of generals, and priestesses once protected by vows. Each was categorized, recorded, and taxed according to their service. The palace had accountants, not pimps. Contracts, not whispers. Shame had become an entry in the imperial budget. The mechanism was astonishingly methodical. Caligula's fiscal reforms, once hailed as creative, had a second purpose: to transform desire into revenue. He revived the old crown tax, a fee paid to the emperor on special occasions, and expanded it to include gifts of pleasure. Senators were required to offer women from their households as part of this tribute. The imperial treasurers dutifully logged each offering, assigning market values, as if cataloguing horses or amphorae of wine. It was the perfect synthesis of Roman efficiency and depravity. Sex became a fiscal instrument, humiliation an administrative category. Historians later called it moral collapse. But within the logic of empire, it was merely another form of extraction. From Egypt came grain, from Spain silver, from the bodies of Rome loyalty. In the archives, fragments of papyrus survive listing payments from provinces for divine celebration. Some scholars suspect these were euphemisms for human tributes young women sent as tokens of devotion to the living God. Each transaction bled into the next until the line between taxation and sacrifice vanished. Even slaves, once the lowest stratum of the Roman economy, were reorganized. Those deemed attractive were removed from labor rosters and reassigned to the palace service corps, officially designated ornaments. Their upkeep was charged to the state treasury, their use recorded as imperial entertainment. The transformation was complete from human property to state assets of pleasure. Caligula had discovered a truth. Rome had long denied that empire was at its core a machine for turning bodies into value. He merely stripped away the pretense. What others hid in rhetoric, he paraded as law. To sustain this machinery, he needed legitimacy. So, he wove desire into divine justification. The emperor he proclaimed was Jupiter's incarnation, and thus, every act of his will, sexual, financial, or violent, was cosmic balance. When he took a senator's wife, it was not adultery, it was taxation in flesh. When he imposed a levy on temple prostitutes, it was not corruption, it was tribute to the gods through him. And the empire obeyed, because disobedience now meant blasphemy. At the heart of it all stood the imperial treasury, the fiscus. Its clerks, trained in mathematics and morality alike, recorded the profits from what were delicately labelled donations to the divine person. The figures were staggering. Some provinces doubled their payments in fear of appearing impious. Senators borrowed money to fund Caligula's spectacles of lust, knowing that financial ruin was safer than refusal. A strange inversion had occurred. Rome, once proud of its law and virtue, now found strength in its degradation. The emperor's appetite was limitless, but it kept the economy moving. Taverns, perfumers, linen merchants, and jewelers all thrived on the commerce of shame. Even moralists grew rich writing treatises condemning the very corruption that fed them. The people whispered, but paid. The priests blushed, but blessed. The scribes hesitated, then signed. Complicity became the foundation of stability. Through it all, Caligula watched with clinical fascination. He did not simply desire, he audited desire. Each conquest, each humiliation, each coerced act was data in his living experiment, the testing of Rome's moral elasticity. How much could an empire built on discipline endure before it collapsed into indulgence? His conclusion was brutal. There was no limit. The economy absorbed everything, even its own desecration. As long as taxes were paid and grain arrived from Egypt, no one dared interrupt the emperor's ledger. The empire's heart kept beating, pumping coins instead of blood. And yet, in the shadows of the treasury, something shifted. Among the clerks and secretaries who processed the donations, guilt began to ferment. They could calculate the profit of degradation, but not its cost to the soul. A few started leaving lines blank in the record's silent rebellions that no one dared speak of. Outside, the city glistened as always. Gladiators fought, poets recited, temples smoked with incense. But the scent of the empire had changed. Underneath the myrrh and olive oil lingered something metallic, intimate, the odor of a civilization monetizing its own shame. Caligula had turned desire into law into ledger, and ledger into scripture. The empire's faith was no longer in justice or virtue, but in the profitability of obedience. When an empire learns to profit from desecration, what happens when the gods themselves become commodities? The Roman Empire prided itself on law, the invisible architecture that held the world together. Every contract, every treaty, every execution was written into eternity. But under Caligula, the law ceased to be text. It became theatre. The Senate chamber, once the sanctum of discipline, turned into a stage where obedience performed itself. Statues of ancestors looked down, as if witnessing blasphemy, yet their marble silence became the perfect audience. Caligula presided not as emperor, but as director, rewriting decrees in the language of humiliation. Each edict began as law ended, as lust. The ritual was chillingly consistent. A decree would be announced perhaps about inheritance, or the regulation of dowries, and then interrupted. The emperor would summon the wife or daughter of a senator, forcing the assembly to watch as legality dissolved into mockery. What began as administrative formality turned into public desecration. Rome's greatest institution became his script. One evening, according to Cassius Dio Caligula, summoned a widow who had petitioned the Senate over her late husband's estate. As senators rose in solemn debate, he beckoned her forward, praised her devotion, and kissed her mouth before all. When she froze, he laughed, declaring, "Her claim is approved." The chamber erupted in forced applause. The case was closed. Justice had become spectacle, and shame its seal. Each new session blurred the line between decree and performance. Caligula once staged a mock trial where the accused was guilt itself. He appointed priests and senators as jurors, then called them one by one to stand and confess imaginary sins. Those who refused were charged with impiety. Those who obeyed were rewarded with the emperor's cruel smile. The verdict was always the same. The law served only one God himself. The Senate, stripped of meaning, learned the grammar of survival to bow was safer than to argue. They adjusted their robes' feigned laughter and signed decrees they no longer understood. Each signature became a confession that Rome's logic, the belief that virtue could be legislated, had collapsed. And yet, the records continued. Scrolls were sealed, dates inscribed, wax stamps pressed. The bureaucratic rhythm of empire persisted as if paperwork could contain madness. But every document was a lie, an official record of obedience dressed as reason. Caligula knew exactly what he was doing. His perversions were not accidents. They were pedagogy. He was teaching Rome the new meaning of law, that the emperor's desire was the constitution. To make that truth unforgettable, he turned legal process into performance art. Trials were held in banquet halls, witnesses summoned between courses. The accused were forced to serve their own judges wine. Those who pleaded innocence had to do so while kneeling at the emperor's feet. The ceremony blurred into cruelty, cruelty blurred into spectacle, and spectacle blurred into governance. Seneca, still young then, watched in horror. Years later, he would write that tyranny's greatest invention was to disguise punishment as entertainment. But in Caligula's reign, the disguise was gone. Rome watched itself laughing. When the law became theatre, the crowd became complicit. Citizens began attending trials for pleasure, gossiping about the latest performances. The emperor's humour infected the public. The moral rot was no longer confined to the palace. It had entered the bloodstream of Rome. The Senate mocked itself, and the people cheered. There were moments when even the marble seemed to protest. Senators whispered that the gods would strike him down, but none dared move. Because to oppose the performance was to admit the show was real, and to admit that meant death. Caligula's genius was to understand the psychology of domination. Violence terrifies, humiliation converts. A corpse can't obey, but a shamed man will obey forever. He didn't need to rewrite Rome's laws. He simply performed them until meaning collapsed. He called it reform. He claimed to cleanse corruption by exposing it. In truth, he only stripped away illusion. The empire that prided itself on justice discovered that its laws were as fragile as its gods sustained, only by the fear of seeing them broken. By the 3rd year of his reign, decrees were no longer legal documents, but imperial monologues. Senators gathered not to legislate, but to witness. Rome's greatest invention, the rule of law, had become its most obscene ritual. And still, the records continued to pile up edicts, charters, oaths, all signed under the same divine formula as the emperor wills. When the archives are read today, historians find no laws of Caligula that make sense. Only performances, only props. The ink of governance mixed with the sweat of shame. Because the empire's law had learned a fatal lesson, the more it degraded itself, the more it proved his divinity. The senators left the chamber in silence, each carrying a copy of the decree he'd witnessed defiled. Rome continued to function. Taxes were collected. Trials were scheduled. The illusion of civilization endured. But beneath the marble order, justice had become theatre and theatre empire. If law could become performance, what would happen when the temple itself became the stage? The gods of Rome had always been practical. They protected the harvest, blessed the armies, punished the faithless. Religion was not mystery, it was contract. But under Caligula, that sacred contract was torn apart and rewritten in his own blood. When he declared himself Jupiter made flesh, Rome's temples trembled not from earthquake, but from uncertainty. Priests who had once mediated between mortals and the divine now stood before a living God who demanded not prayer but surrender. The rituals continued, but their meaning inverted. Offerings once meant for heaven were redirected to the palace. Sacrifice became spectacle. Worship became fear. The Vestal virgins, guardians of Rome's eternal flame women, sworn to 30 years of chastity, were his first targets. Their purity had long symbolized the moral strength of the Republic, the unbroken lineage between Rome and its gods. To violate them was to violate the soul of the city. So he did. Ancient chroniclers describe one night when Caligula stormed the temple of Vesta with torches blazing, priests scattering in confusion. He ordered the virgins assembled, examined them as if inspecting livestock, and dragged two into the darkness. The following morning, the temple doors opened to silence. The sacred flame still burned, but something unseen had gone out. The city pretended not to notice. The Senate offered prayers for divine harmony. Poets wrote hymns to Jupiter's human form. The priests themselves argued that perhaps the emperor's touch had sanctified, not defiled. Theology bent under fear. The logic was grotesque, yet convenient. If the god desired, then desire was holy. Caligula understood the power of this inversion. By desecrating the sacred, he didn't merely insult the gods, he colonized them. Every shrine, every altar, every priest became an extension of his will. He ordered his statue installed in the Temple of Jerusalem, demanding worship from a people who recognized no god but their own. The command sparked outrage across the East. Delegations begged him to reconsider invoking prophecy and reason. He only laughed. "If they will not bow to me," he said, "then I will place myself among them." To him, divine resistance was proof of his divinity. Rome's priests whispered of omens. Comets, eclipses, and dying animals filled the city with dread. Yet, the emperor seemed energized by their fear. He began holding nocturnal ceremonies, where wine mixed with blood and acolytes forced or willing chanted hymns that blurred the line between praise and moan. In these ceremonies, he enacted a theology of domination, that the gods themselves had surrendered their power to him. When he dressed as Mercury, he declared trid sacred to his desire. As Mars, he consecrated war to lust. As Venus, he blurred gender itself, appearing in gold-stitched robes and demanding to be adored for his beauty. Every costume was a decree, every decree a blasphemy. But the horror lay not only in the acts, it lay in the response. The priests obeyed. The Senate sent congratulations. Rome's most disciplined bureaucracy began documenting miracles that never happened, divine visions that no one saw. The lie became institutional. This was not madness, it was strategy. By desecrating what was holy, Caligula proved that no power existed above his own. The Republic's gods were now props, their altars annexed into imperial property. The temple tithe was redirected to fund his games and divine entertainments. When questioned, the treasury scribes replied that the emperor's pleasure was the purest form of worship. Through this corruption, he stumbled upon a principle older than empire, that religion stripped of reverence becomes the most efficient form of control. People will die for faith, but they will also endure anything done in its name. Caligula fused politics with ritual until both became indistinguishable. To obey the state was to worship the emperor. To worship the emperor was to accept the desecration of all else. In this union of divinity and power, Rome itself became a temple, whose altar was humiliation. Citizens lined the streets during his processions, forced to kneel as he passed, dressed as Jupiter, the thunderbolt in hand. When lightning struck near the palace one afternoon, he claimed it was Jupiter, saluting his reflection. The Senate decreed it a sign of divine favor. The flame of Vesta still burned, but no longer for Rome it burned for him. And in that single transformation, the empire crossed an invisible line. The gods no longer judged the emperor judged the gods. If even divinity could be conquered, what remained untouched? Perhaps the invisible class who carried out his orders, the unseen machinery of obedience itself. Every empire hides its truth below the marble. Beneath Caligula's golden ceilings, beneath the laughter of senators and the hymns to his godhood, lay a world without names. The machinery that made the spectacle run. They were the cooks, the torchbearers, the cleaners of marble floors slick with wine and blood. They were the slaves. Their hands prepared the banquets of blasphemy. Their eyes saw what Rome could not afford to remember. Historians rarely mention them, yet they were the empire's nervous system, the invisible body of Rome. When Caligula's appetites expanded beyond the limits of reason, it was they who ensured the performances continued. They built the stages dressed, the victims scrubbed the stains. The empire's purity, its illusion of control, depended on their silence. In the kitchens of the Palatine Hill, slaves moved like ghosts. At night, when the emperor's desires grew restless, a messenger would appear at the servants' quarters. A girl would be chosen, her name recorded once in a ledger, then erased. She would be led through corridors lined with torches and disappear into the emperor's chamber. By morning, the records would call it service, rendered to the divine household. To the administrators, it was data. To her, it was the end of personhood. Some were born into slavery, others sold by desperate families to pay debts or taxes. The empire called it commerce. Caligula called it providence. His mother's slaves, his father's soldiers. The children of conquered Gaul all became part of a system that converted human breath into imperial order. What separated this from previous emperors was not the existence of cruelty, but its bureaucratization. Caligula turned degradation into policy. He instituted a palace registry for attendants of divine pleasure, assigning them numbers, ranks, and duties. Some were given perfumes, some trained in silence, others selected for pain. Each role was codified, each suffering indexed. A surviving fragment of Suetonius notes that Caligula's corridors were lined with guards who pretended not to see. To witness was to share guilt. To speak was to vanish. Silence was the first currency of empire. But silence is not emptiness, it remembers. Archaeologists have found scratched marks on tiles from the Palatine substructures, crude initials, prayers in vulgar Latin, half-erased names of mothers, traces of people erased from history, but unable to erase themselves. In this underworld of service, fear was routine, but complicity was the rule. Some slaves learned to anticipate commands before they were spoken to, smile at cruelty to applaud humiliation. In that adaptation lay the empire's secret genius. Its victims sustained it. Rome's grandeur depended not on consent, but on self-preservation through obedience. The same logic extended beyond the palace. Builders who erected temples to Caligula's divinity were often slaves themselves, crafting the altars that justified their bondage. Fishermen hauled delicacies from distant shores for feasts they could never attend. The empire consumed them invisibly, turning muscle into ritual. The moral cost was shared. Guards who escorted trembling captives to the emperor's rooms hardened their hearts one order at a time. The scribes who logged the confiscations and deaths trained their hands to move without conscience. Bureaucracy became moral anesthesia. When later generations asked, how could it happen? The answer was written in their survival. Each believed silence was safer than truth. And yet beneath that silence, resentment grew. The slaves heard the screams, the guards smelled the iron, the clerks read the edicts dripping with double meanings. They knew that power's mask of divinity was cracking, that even gods bled. Some began whispering in the corridors' murmurs that one day the emperor would face the same fate as those he broke. For now, though, they endured. Endurance was their rebellion, the only weapon left to the powerless. If Caligula's Rome was a body, its nerves were the enslaved. Every lash, every command, every whispered order travelled through them. Without their hands, his rituals would falter. Without their silence, his divinity would collapse. But power built on silence is always temporary, because the more it demands invisibility, the more ghosts it creates. And ghosts never stay quiet. If the unseen body sustained the empire, what force sustained their silence? What turned fear itself into the empire's most reliable infrastructure? Every empire runs on logistics grain, gold soldiers' roads. Caligula's Rome added one more fear. It was not chaos, but a carefully engineered system, a bureaucracy of dread that reached every household from the palace to the slums. Fear had departments. It had clerks. It had a calendar. At the top stood the Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, but reprogrammed to protect his moods. Their armor glittered like divine sanction. Each morning they received sealed orders, some to escort prisoners, some to invite senators to the palace, others to deliver anonymous gifts that carried invisible threats. The Guard became the courier service of terror, ensuring that every Roman woke under the emperor's gaze. Within months, rumor itself had become an administrative tool. The streets of Rome hummed with stories of who had offended the divine Caesar, whose name had vanished from records, whose estate had been reassigned. No one knew what was true, which made it perfect. When fear is systemic, it doesn't need accuracy, it needs repetition. Caligula mastered this psychology. He would summon senators at midnight for consultations, let them wait in silence for hours, then dismiss them without a word. The uncertainty was exquisite punishment. Without crime, mercy without reason. Even the act of being ignored became political theatre. In the Senate, silence acquired new grammar. A pause meant danger, laughter meant survival. Men spoke in riddles to avoid contradiction. Each word carried the weight of its possible misinterpretation. Rome, the civilization that built itself on eloquence, had entered an age where the highest virtue was muteness. The emperor didn't simply demand obedience. He measured it. He watched how men knelt, how long they bowed, how quickly they agreed. His court scribes recorded everything: gestures, hesitations, tremors. Fear became quantifiable, an index of loyalty. He often walked among the guards at night, disguised, listening to whispers. Those who spoke too freely were executed. Those who stayed silent were rewarded. The lessons spread like a contagion. Safety belonged to those who erased themselves. The people learned quickly. A merchant accused of mocking the emperor's new temple smashed his own goods in the forum to prove devotion. A poet burned his manuscripts before anyone could accuse him of satire. Mothers taught their children never to speak the emperor's name unless praising it. Terror became a civic virtue, but there was precision to this cruelty. Caligula understood that total oppression exhausts itself. To preserve the system, fear had to oscillate, moments of horror followed by false calm. He would stage sudden acts of generosity, pardoning prisoners, scattering gold to crowds weeping in public over Rome's sufferings. The city would breathe again, only to choke when the next execution came. Hope became part of the control loop. Even the Praetorians lived in terror. They were both enforcers and hostages. Any delay, any gesture mistaken for contempt, could turn them from instruments to victims. Some guarded his chambers, knowing that tomorrow they might be executed for guarding him too well. In that climate, the empire learned the purest form of discipline: self-censorship as survival. No longer forced from above, fear had migrated inward. Citizens became their own jailers. Rome's infrastructure of fear was invisible but omnipresent. The same system that carried grain from Africa now carried rumor decree and denunciation. The postal routes doubled as veins for terror. A whisper in Judea could kill a man in Rome within weeks. Historians later argued whether Caligula was insane. But insanity implies loss of control. He was in perfect control. His madness was design. He turned paranoia into administration, personal insecurity into political doctrine. Every empire afterward, from emperors to dictators, would learn from his method to make fear efficient. You must make it feel natural. And it worked. The city still bustled. Markets thrived. Plays were performed. The empire looked unchanged, yet every smile was rehearsed, every cheer a calculation. The Roman peace, the Pax Romana, was merely fear successfully organized. But beneath that stability, something corrosive began to spread. When an entire civilization learns to survive by silence, it loses the ability to recognize truth. And when truth dies, no tyranny needs to kill again, it simply waits. Fear had built Rome's new order as perfectly as aqueducts once carried water. It was the infrastructure that never rusted. If fear could organize an empire, what would happen when spectacle itself became its governing religion? When the crowd's applause replaced law as the heartbeat of Rome? Fear kept Rome quiet, but it was spectacle that kept Rome obedient. Caligula understood that terror alone could not sustain worship. The empire needed performance, a public ritual where humiliation could be disguised as glory. Rome had always loved the stage triumphal processions, gladiatorial games, religious festivals. Caligula did not destroy these traditions, he weaponized them. The transformation began subtly. He expanded the calendar of festivals, declaring new holidays in honor of divine harmony. Temples, amphitheaters, and circuses overflowed with gold and incense. From the outside, it looked like prosperity. Inside it was theater carefully choreographed to teach submission. Every public event became a mirror of his rule. In the arena, the line between punishment and entertainment vanished. Condemned men were forced to reenact myths where mortals challenged the gods and always died for it. Those who hesitated were whipped until they screamed the emperor's name. The audience, drunk on the illusion of participation, applauded the slaughter as moral order restored. This was the genius of Caligula's system. He transformed the crowd into accomplices. He made Rome's citizens actors in their own degradation. Each cheer, each laugh, each festival chant erased another boundary between public virtue and imperial cruelty. In the same breath that they praised the gods, they praised their tormentor. Seneca later wrote, "Rome forgot to be ashamed." At first, the people cheered out of habit, but habit hardened into ritual, and ritual became faith. The man who ruled them through lust and fear now ruled them through spectacle. The games were not diversions, they were demonstrations of theology. The emperor's power was displayed in blood, and the crowd's acceptance of that blood proved its divinity. During one infamous series of games, Caligula staged the myth of Orpheus the poet who charmed beasts with song. The role of Orpheus was given to a musician condemned for mocking the emperor. The man sang beautifully, pleading for mercy through melody, until the gates opened and wild animals tore him apart. The crowd gasped, then clapped. Caligula smiled. He had transformed art itself into a sermon about power. Beauty survives only until the ruler grows bored. The amphitheater became a parliament of emotion, where loyalty was measured in volume. Those who didn't cheer loudly enough were noted. Guards walked the stands, eyes sharp for hesitation. The people learned to cheer until their throats bled. The empire learned to confuse fear with celebration. The theater spread beyond the arena. The emperor turned state ceremonies into mock epics. At a banquet, he would summon senators' wives to perform dances in honor of Venus, then mock them for clumsiness. He once staged a fake wedding between himself and the moon goddess, inviting the entire Senate as witnesses. Priests read fabricated omens, musicians played hymns, and the emperor kissed the air as though embracing a celestial bride. The audience watched half laughing, half petrified, uncertain whether the performance was a joke, a ritual, or treason to disbelieve. To Caligula, the distinction did not matter. The point was total participation. Whether in laughter, terror, or worship, Rome was to respond as one body to his command. Spectacle became the empire's immune system. Each grotesque performance inoculated the people against conscience. They grew addicted to awe. When cruelty arrived wrapped in theater, no one called it cruelty, they called it entertainment. Even the provinces joined the performance. Statues of Caligula appeared in marketplaces, his image stamped on coins depicting him between Jupiter and Mars. In Alexandria, he ordered temples to stage living plays where slaves impersonated gods and were sacrificed at the finale. Local governors competed to outdo one another in displays of devotion blending worship with theatre until both lost meaning. The psychological brilliance of it was terrifying. Caligula realized that Rome's greatest addiction was not violence or sex, it was spectacle itself. The empire defined itself through what it watched. To control the stage was to control reality. He turned the imperial court into a continuous play. Guests arrived unsure whether they would leave as honored companions or condemned actors. A senator might dine beside the emperor one night only to find himself the star of a comic execution the next. The lines between life art and punishment blurred until Rome itself became a set. The playwrights of the era struggled to compete. What script could rival an emperor who made his own tragedies from living flesh? Caligula called it restoring joy to Rome. Behind the illusion of joy was calculation. Spectacle replaced law as the glue of empire. What once bound Rome through duty, now bound it through collective performance. To disbelieve was treason. To refuse to watch was rebellion. Every citizen, knowingly or not, played a role. It is said that after one festival, the emperor walked alone through the empty arena, gazing at the blood-streaked sand. "The gods are satisfied," he murmured, then added, "and so am I." He had discovered a horrifying equivalence to please the gods, and to please himself were the same. Historians would later argue that these excesses destroyed Rome's dignity. But they misunderstand. Caligula was not dismantling Rome, he was revealing it. The empire had always lived through spectacle triumphs that paraded corpses as trophies, temples funded by conquest, the people pacified by games. Caligula merely turned the mirror inward, forcing Rome to watch itself. The people laughed because the alternative was screaming. Senators applauded because silence had become a death sentence. Priests blessed because blasphemy was survival. And in that collective participation lay the secret of power. The crowd no longer needed chains when applause was voluntary. Fear had built the structure, but spectacle became the faith that held it. In that fusion, Rome reached a new stage of tyranny, not one ruled by swords or laws, but by the choreography of emotion. The empire no longer feared death, it feared missing the show. And yet, beneath the roars of approval, a quieter rhythm began to pulse exhaustion. The games grew longer, the laughter hollower. Each performance demanded a larger sacrifice to feel divine. Even divinity needs an audience, and audiences eventually tire. When spectacle becomes governance, collapse always begins backstage. When the crowd stops clapping, what remains of a god? When performance is no longer enough, where does an empire turn to conspiracy or to self-destruction? The end did not come with revolt or trumpet blasts. It came with silence. Rome's greatest killer of gods was not rebellion, it was exhaustion. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, the empire had run out of breath. The crowd's cheers grew weaker. The laughter at his feasts delayed the applause, hesitant. Even fear has a rhythm, and Rome's had begun to falter. The emperor noticed, and that was the beginning of the end. He began pacing the marble corridors at night, whispering to the walls, accusing statues of treachery. He interrogated the moon for omens. He accused the gods of envy, then forgave them in the same breath. The stage he had built to command the empire had become a prison, his own theatre of paranoia. The Senate, hollowed by years of humiliation, learned a new form of courage: stillness. They said nothing, but their eyes no longer followed him with the same devotion. The Praetorian Guard, once his instruments of terror, now stood rigid at attention, hands close to the hilts of their swords. Fear, once a current flowing outward from the emperor, now began to circle back toward him. It started with whispers. A tribune spoke softly to another at the barracks. "He bleeds, doesn't he?" The sentence itself was treason. But in that moment, something shifted. The rediscovery of a truth Rome had forgotten: gods can die. Caligula's cruelty had reached a saturation point. His decrees grew erratic. He ordered statues of himself placed in every temple, demanded that the gods be decapitated so their heads could wear his likeness. He declared war on Neptune, marching his troops to the sea and ordering them to stab the waves. They obeyed, of course, because disobedience meant death. But as they filled their helmets with seashells, pretending they were trophies, the soldiers laughed quietly. That laughter, muffled beneath helmets of bronze, was the Empire's first rebellion. The conspirators who finally moved against him were not heroes. They were men who had survived too long by submission guards, secretaries, minor senators. Their revolt was not born of virtue, but of fatigue. The Empire's body had grown too sick to keep carrying its own disease. The plan formed in whispers, carried through corridors where once screams had echoed. They did not shout for liberty or justice. Those words had lost meaning. They only wanted air, a night, quiet, without dread. On the morning of January 24th, 41, AD Caligula strode through a passage beneath the Palatine for another performance, a festival honoring himself. He was radiant drunk on divinity, surrounded by guards who hid their disgust behind stoic masks. The marble floor gleamed like a mirror. Then one of them, a man named Cassius Chaerea, once mocked by Caligula for his soft voice, stepped forward. The emperor smiled, thinking it was a bow. Instead, steel flashed. The first stab cut through his throat. Then the next, and another. The emperor staggered backward, eyes wide, not in pain, but disbelief. He had never imagined that the play could end without his permission. Blood splattered the walls that had once echoed with hymns to his name. The god of Rome fell not to rebellion, but to the quiet precision of men who had learned his own method: perform the act without emotion, make violence administrative. The guards struck again and again until the divine voice was gone. The corridor smelled of iron and incense. When it was over, the conspirators stood in silence. No shouts of victory, no speeches, no freedom proclaimed. Only breathing the first honest sound in years. They looked at one another, half horrified by what they had done. Then, instinctively, they began cleaning. One mopped the blood. Another dragged the body into a linen sheet. Bureaucracy resumed instantly. The empire, even in rebellion, stayed orderly. Outside the city did not yet know. The games continued. The crowd still roared, unaware that their god had bled to death beneath their feet. By nightfall, rumors spread. The emperor was ill. The emperor had ascended. The emperor was reborn. Rome could not yet believe in his mortality, but the Praetorian camp knew. They gathered quietly, wiping their blades. For the first time in years, their hands did not shake. and so ended the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus Caligula, the living god. Not slain by righteous men, not toppled by moral revolt, but consumed by the silence he had built. The same silence that had once protected him now smothered him. The empire did not erupt in joy or grief. It simply inhaled cautiously, like a patient emerging from fever. The senators convened, issued decrees, appointed a new emperor. Life went on. The apparatus of power continued indifferent to the corpse it had produced. Rome had killed its god, but kept his system. Because the true legacy of Caligula was not his cruelty, nor his lust, nor his madness. It was the machinery of obedience. He perfected the idea that power could survive any atrocity as long as it was performed beautifully. In killing him, the conspirators believed they were restoring Rome's virtue. In truth, they were only resetting the stage. The actors changed. The script endured. The morning after Caligula's death, Rome did not awaken it, exhaled. The tension that had gripped the city for years loosened not with celebration, but with disbelief. A god was dead, and yet the sky did not fall. The marble temples still caught the dawn light. The fountains still ran, the markets still opened. The city's heartbeat continued steady, indifferent. It was as if the empire had been waiting for this day without realizing it. An organism shedding a diseased limb, yet feeling the phantom pain linger. The Senate convened hastily, cloaks disheveled voices trembling. No one dared use the word murder. They called it divine correction, the restoration of human order. Behind those phrases hid fear. Fear that the new god might rise before the old one's blood had dried. The conspirators, expecting applause, found none. The people were silent. They had forgotten how to speak without permission. When soldiers announced that Caligula was gone, the crowd stared blankly, as if hearing the end of a story they no longer believed in. For years, they had been taught that his will was law, his pleasure divine. To imagine the world without him required imagination. Rome had lost. That was his final victory. Even in death, he defined the terms of reality. In the palace, servants resumed their duties as though nothing had happened. Blood had been mopped away before sunrise. The marble corridors gleamed again. The cooks prepared breakfast for an emperor who would never eat it. Order restored itself automatically, the reflex of a civilization conditioned to function under tyranny. The new ruler, Claudius, was discovered hiding behind a curtain shaking. The guards hailed him, emperor not because they admired him, but because empire could not exist without a head. Rome's machinery needed continuity more than conscience. Caligula's corpse was still warm when the Senate drafted new decrees, stamped with new seals, repeating the old formulas. The performance continued under new direction, but the air had changed. Beneath the surface, calm trauma had become infrastructure. The empire could rebuild its walls, its laws, its ceremonies, but not its soul. The scars were everywhere, invisible but permanent. In the homes of senators, wives who had endured the emperor's visits spoke little. Their silence stretched across the years like cracks in marble. Families destroyed by humiliation now shared dinner tables with their perpetrators. Rome's dignity had survived in body, not in spirit. Among the slaves, the news spread in whispers. Some prayed, some laughed quietly, others stared in disbelief. Freedom did not follow the tyrant's death. The system remained. The guards still patrolled the taxes, still drained the orders, still came. Only the voice issuing them had changed. They understood what senators did not, that empires do not die with men, they molt. A few chroniclers dared to record the aftermath. One wrote that Caligula's ghost lingered in every corridor, not haunting, but supervising. The empire's architecture carried his imprint. Bureaucrats signed decrees with steadier hands, but emptier eyes. Priests resumed rituals, though they no longer believed in anything beyond survival. Rome had learned to live without belief. That was the scar the moral amputation left by too many years of enforced obedience. When people survive by silence, they forget how to speak truth even when free. Fear, once an emotion, had hardened into custom. The new emperor promised clemency, justice, restoration of dignity. But the Senate bowed too low. The people cheered too carefully, and the soldiers watched too closely. It was all habit now. Even entertainment continued. The amphitheatre reopened within weeks. New games were held to honor the rebirth of the empire. The crowd cheered again, louder perhaps to prove that joy had returned. But the rhythm of their applause was different. It was slower, uncertain, hollow. They had seen too much. Caligula's statues were removed, but not destroyed. Some were recarved into likenesses of Claudius. Others were left standing heads, replaced bodies intact. A grotesque metaphor for the empire itself, the same frame, a different face. Rome's poets tried to find language for what had happened. One wrote, "The gods were silent, so we made gods of men. Now the men are silent, and we do not know where the gods have gone." That was the legacy, the psychological ruin that outlived his reign. Caligula had proven that power could penetrate every boundary, law, family, faith, and still leave a functioning society. The horror was not that he broke Rome, but that he didn't. The machine kept running, humming over the graves of its conscience. Historians, centuries later, would call his rule a mad interlude, an aberration in Rome's greatness. But that comfort is a lie. What if the aberration was not Caligula's cruelty, but the illusion that Rome ever possessed virtue immune to it? The empire that survived him was cleaner, more cautious, more stable, but hollow. The law was restored, yet no one truly trusted it. The temples reopened, yet no one truly believed. Rome had learned that everything sacred could be desecrated and still continue to function. That knowledge was its curse and its genius. The scars were not meant to heal, they were meant to remind. The city of marble still glittered, but under its surface ran a quiet understanding, a shared confession that would never be spoken aloud. Nothing collapses faster than faith in goodness, and nothing endures longer than the habit of submission. And so, Rome moved forward, magnificent and broken, bearing the invisible inheritance of its god's cruelty. The empire had not died, it had adapted. In the centuries that followed, Caligula's name became shorthand for madness. Poets called him the Beast in Purple. Historians, desperate to protect the myth of Rome's greatnesses, confined his cruelty to a single chapter of divine insanity. Yet every empire that came after Nero, Domitian, Commodus borrowed from his script. They did not imitate his lusts, they imitated his system. Because Caligula was not an accident. He was the logic of empire made flesh. Rome had always believed itself eternal because it worshipped order, law, hierarchy, ritual. But Caligula revealed the rot beneath that faith, that order itself can become the purest form of corruption when it demands obedience without question. He showed that civilization doesn't collapse when the monstrous seizes power. It collapses when everyone else learns to live with the monster. After his death, the Senate cleaned his name from monuments, rewrote laws, performed acts of purification. They declared a new era of stability. But what they really restored was the comfort of forgetting. Rome's philosophy had shifted from virtue to endurance. It no longer asked what is good, but what can survive. That question became the secret creed of every empire to follow. The irony is almost mathematical. Caligula's tyranny taught Rome how to endure tyranny. He had industrialized humiliation, and in doing so made it normal. The more the empire remembered his horrors, the more it accepted them as inevitabilities of power. There will always be another Caligula, whispered later generations, but the empire will continue. That, for Rome, was victory. Yet, in this victory, hid decay disguised as wisdom. To call survival virtue is to sanctify rot. The philosophers of the later empire wrestled with this paradox. Seneca, once nearly killed by Caligula, wrote that true evil is not chaos, but the system that sustains it. Epictetus himself, a slave, taught that freedom exists only within the mind, because the world cannot be reformed. Marcus Aurelius, 2 centuries later, still meditated on cruelty as an inevitability of rule. Their stoicism was noble, but it was also surrender. They had made peace with horror. Rome's moral architecture never recovered from that peace. By the time the Colosseum rose, the empire's cruelty no longer shocked anyone. Spectacle had become culture law, had become theatre, and religion had become ceremony without faith. Citizens no longer asked what was right, only what was permitted. The empire that once called itself res publica, the public thing, had turned inward, private, self-referential, obsessed with maintaining its own reflection. That is the philosophy of decay, not destruction, but self-preservation at the cost of meaning. And that is Caligula's true legacy. He proved that power can outlive morality, that you can hollow out a civilization, leave only ritual and marble, and it will still call itself eternal. He proved that humiliation can be systematized and still appear orderly. He proved that gods can be murdered without consequence, because the faith that created them was already dead. The empire survived him, but in surviving it, it became him. Each emperor thereafter learned to balance cruelty with spectacle, mercy with manipulation, to keep the illusion of divinity alive. The citizens learned the choreography of complicity, cheer, pray, forget. The Senate learned to legislate obedience. The soldiers learned to guard both tyrants and ideals with the same discipline. And the historians, those who wrote of his madness, learned to write themselves innocent. But the bones beneath Rome's marble never stopped whispering. Archaeologists still find them, the scratches of enslaved builders, the defaced statues of gods, the melted coins bearing his sneering profile. Each artifact asks the same question: did Rome really survive him, or did it become his monument? That question does not belong to history alone. Every civilization that sanctifies power, every nation that builds temples to its own image, carries Caligula's ghost in its foundations. Because he was not only a man, he was a mirror. Look into it, and you will see the same temptation to confuse dominance with order, endurance with virtue, spectacle with truth. Rome taught the world that greatness can coexist with cruelty, that beauty can camouflage horror, that the machinery of empire can hum smoothly while its soul corrodes. Caligula only revealed that this coexistence was not a whole, it was the design. When his assassins struck, they thought they were killing a monster. In truth, they were completing a circle. They silenced the symptom, not the system. The empire's philosophy, polished and cruel, continued to echo through time, better corruption, then collapse, better fear than freedom, better silence than doubt. That is why his story endures, not as scandal, but as prophecy. Because every age believes it is too wise to fall into madness until the crowd starts cheering again, until fear becomes infrastructure, until the law becomes theatre, and until the gods once more wear human faces. Caligula's Rome never truly ended. It only changed costumes. And when history asks how a world of law and beauty could turn desire into government and humiliation into religion, the answer will always be the same. It began the moment we mistook survival for civilization.